Welcome classic rock fans to my much anticipated video, Great Bands That Had One Huge Weak Link. This is an article that was published on new80skids.com and is written by Amber Ward. I have to thank a Canadian stud muffin who drew my attention to this, so go and check his channel out, he does some good stuff on there. So let's look at this list to try and determine those that we actually agree with. From the batshit bonkers to the she might have a point there. From her extensive list, I've extrapolated just 10. So let's get on with it, shall we? Number 10 is U2's Adam Clayton, which many of you said deserves to be on the list. I'm not so sure, to be honest with you, though. I admit that U2 as a band have lost their mojo some years ago, I think. But I must admit to loving them back in the day. I think Achtung Baby is a remarkably good album, in my opinion. And one thing about U2 is I think they had a pretty solid rhythm section that provided these excellent platforms from which the Edge could produce these affected guitar soundscapes, and from which Bono could posture. And who could ignore that battered precision bass and rattle and hum? I mean, granted he's no Chris Squire, but I think he's pretty solid in this band. Number 9 is Anthony Kiedis from the Red Hot Chili Peppers. Now many feel that his off-putting showmanship is only matched by his somewhat off-putting vocals, which only serves as a distraction from the rest of the band. Some have argued that this guy has more pitch issues than Wayne Rooney, and that's especially apparent when the band perform live. I think he's certainly lacking in some technical skills maybe, and I think hitting the note on point, not flat or sharp, is a objectively measurable skill when one is a singer in a band. So maybe there are some technical weaknesses, but I think the man oozes charisma. I think he's a great front man, and I think he's a great writer as well. Forgive me if I'm wrong, but I think he writes for the band as well, doesn't he? He has a very distinctive voice that serves the overall vibe of the Red Hot Chili Peppers quite well. So I wouldn't describe him as the band's weakest link. I could have done without the pork swords in socks moment, but this level of cockery, I suppose, draws attention to the band. Number 8 is Liam Gallagher from Oasis. On this one, I must admit, I'm kind of sat on the fence. I mean, Liam Gallagher brought a certain lager, lout swagger to this band, which suited the overall image and sound of Oasis. I mean, I'll be honest with you, I've never been a big Oasis fan anyway, but I've enjoyed some of the work that Noel Gallagher has done with High Flying Birds. I even enjoyed the 2 solo albums that Liam put out, which I believe he's now co-writing with somebody, which is pretty good stuff, I think. I think you could argue that without Noel, these songs would never have been written, but without Liam, they would never have been heard. So, in terms of this one, I'm kind of 50-50 on it. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Number 7 is Linda McCartney from Wings, and I'm loathed to admit that she probably has a point with this one. Linda McCartney was no musician, she was no singer, and that's apparent when she does contribute vocals to, say, Ram and other. And unless it's in a kind of a spirit of a bit of buffoonery, it works quite well, but in terms of actual vocal prowess, she's significantly lacking here. So I suppose you could say technically, musically and lyrically she was the weakest link in this band. However, we've got to think of it this way. Paul wanted her in the band, he wanted her close by him, he wanted her close by him when he was on the road. I think he liked the idea of having somebody who was genuinely loved him on the stage with him. And to quote an article that I found online, he had insisted from the beginning of their marriage that Linda should be involved in his musical projects, notwithstanding her lack of previous experience as a musician, so they did not have to be apart when they were on tour. You can't really argue with that, although technically I suppose she was kind of musically the weak link in Wings. Number 6 is Nick Mason from Pink Floyd. And this is just absolute horseshit. I mean, I agree with Roger Waters that Nick Mason is a grossly underrated drummer. You know, he has a languid style that perfectly suits this band, and without him it just wouldn't sound the same. She says in her article, the limitations of drummer Nick Mason, whose basic approach kept the band from trying the unusual time signatures and faster paced sounds that many other prog acts explored. Now, I've read quite a few books on Pink Floyd, and I haven't found anything like that in there. The main frustrations seem to come from the lack of writing commitment from other members of the band, from Roger Waters himself. But the key ingredients of the Pink Floyd sound, you know, obviously Gilmour's guitar and Richard Wright's wonderful punctuations, even Roger Waters' strangulated bark. Without Nick Mason's drumming, it just doesn't sound like Pink Floyd. And Momentary Lapse of Reason, without Mason's drumming on it, just did not sound like a Pink Floyd album. I mean, you can compare some of his drumming on, say, two Floyd numbers, High Hopes and Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun, miles apart, of course, but they're both interesting because they both demonstrate Nick Mason using his drumming as texture and the way he builds mood and atmosphere, percussively providing the perfect setting to showcase the rest of this band's music. Number 5 is Kenny Jones in The Who. Now, Roger Daltrey is the one that's often talks about Kenny Jones being the weakest link in The Who in terms of his drumming. He has gone on record and he says in his autobiography that Kenny Jones is a great, great drummer, but he just wasn't a great, great drummer for The Who. And he's got a fair point, really. I mean, who could emulate the fruitcakery of Loon, especially behind the kit? So Kenny Jones made it quite clear in his autobiography that he was gonna bring his own distinctive style to the band. Now, Daltrey, of course, is a man out front. He must feel how it's all kind of coming together as a singer. So you've got to respect his point of view here. However, I think Kenny's drumming on those Who albums are just absolutely excellent. Not great albums, to be honest with you, but nevertheless, the drumming is just sound. So I don't think Kenny Jones is the weakest link in The Who. I just think he forced the band to have to reconsider their sound after the death of Keith Moon. Number 4 is Ozzy Osbourne and Black Sabbath. This is one I fundamentally disagree with. I mean, that early, incredible bluesy, progressive, psychedelic sound of those early Sabbath records are perfectly suited to Ozzy's voice. Yes, Ozzy was vocally limited, but I think the angst and tremor in his voice perfectly suits the down-tuned sludge that was this band's wonderful, wonderful music. The article says, if I may quote, his voice was always very limited, which kept the band from exploring the different sounds they would embrace in the 80s. I really don't think that is the case. I think Ozzy left Black Sabbath, shall we say, due to a number of other reasons than that. And of course, Ronnie James Dio is a much, much superior singer, but without the yearn and howl that we get for Ozzy Osbourne's vocals on those early records, they just wouldn't have been the same. Not to mention the very heart of the band as well, which is, of course, in my opinion, Geezer Butler. So this one I fundamentally disagree with. Number 3 is Sid Vicious from the Sex Pistols. This one I do agree with. I believe Sid Vicious was brought into the Pistols simply because of the way he looked. Malcolm McLaren was all about image. He thought image trumped musical ability. He was kind of almost like the Andy Warhol of punk. But I think it was a huge mistake to allow Glenn Matlock to leave, quite frankly. Glenn Matlock was a competent musician who also wrote songs. I think this band took a huge dip once he had gone. Sid Vicious, I don't think contributes any bass to Nevermind the Bollocks. I think the bass is played by Steve Jones, if I'm not mistaken. You can hear some of Sid's bass playing, very swampy bass playing, low in the mix on Bodies. But the fact that it's very low in the mix kind of speaks volumes, doesn't it? The other guys were fairly competent with their instruments, and John Lydon was a great frontman, a good writer, an all-round intelligent guy. But I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure that John Lydon recently has said that it was a mistake bringing Sid into the band. Number 2 is David Lee Roth of Van Halen. This was another one where I'm kind of sat on the fence with. Van Halen defined hard rock, I think, in the 1980s, late 70s, 1980s. And part of that was due to the guitar pyrotechnics of Van Halen, as well as the spandex-clad, crutch-grabbing antics of David Lee Roth. Let's not forget, of course, Michael Anthony's wonderful bass playing and Alex Van Halen's drumming. She says in the article, David Lee Roth's vocals, however, left a lot to be desired, and during live performances he was frequently more interested in showboating than being in time or in tune. But that may well be the case, but it led to a bloody good show overall, I think. They were the complete package, I think. I'm not sure I would have changed the thing about that band, although I have to agree Roth is not a great singer, and the less said about his version of California Girls, the better. Probably the only time in history Brian Wilson wished he was deaf in both ears. Number 1 is Ringo Starr from the Beatles. This is another one that I fundamentally disagree with. Poor Ringo gets a lot of shit from people, but I think he was an excellent drummer and an excellent drummer for the Beatles. She says in her article, Ringo's simplistic drumming and vocals paled in comparison to the skill of his bandmates. Yes, I mean, he wasn't a great singer. Yes, he wasn't particularly a writer in this band. But he is a great drummer, in my opinion, and he composes unique drum parts that very much define the sound of this band. His signature parts, a lot of these Beatles songs, you can listen to his drumming and immediately identify the song. Without his creativity and percussive imagination, the band just wouldn't have sounded like the Beatles, in my opinion. Take, for example, the tom and hi-hat part in the bridge of Something, or the unconventional opening to Come Together, not to mention Ticket to Ride, where Ringo does not play a metronomically perfect groove. That's very much part of the charm of this band, part of the very sound of this band. So enough of that Ringo bashing. How many of these do you agree with? How many of these do you fundamentally disagree with? Leave your comments below. Anyway, I'll leave it there. Thank you for your time in watching this video. I'll leave you with my closing salvo, which is, as you know by now, hope you're well, staying safe, and of course that you keep listening.